Leaked documentary footage tied to 50 Cent has just hit the internet, and it's already shaking the entire hip-hop industry. Artists are reacting in silence, fans are dissecting every clip, and insiders claim this might only be a fraction of what's coming. But the real question is simple. Is this exposing hidden truth or rewriting the story in real time? What happens when one of the most powerful names in hip-hop decides to release footage that allegedly exposes the very people who once stood beside him? Because right now, that question is no longer hypothetical. It's unfolding in real time, and the industry is reacting like something just snapped open that can't be closed again. According to emerging reports and leaked fragments circulating privately before exploding online, a newly surfaced documentary project tied to 50 Cent has triggered an unexpected wave of backlash across the rap industry. What was initially described as a controlled, behind-the-scenes storytelling piece is now being framed by some insiders as something far more volatile, raw, unfiltered footage that certain artists believed would never reach the public. But it did, or at least parts of it did, and that alone was enough to shift everything. Within hours of the first clip spreading, reactions began pouring in. Not through official statements, but through silence, cryptic posts, indirect messages, and carefully worded frustration. Sources close to the situation claim that several artists feel blindsided, accusing the project of selective editing, altered context, and a version of events that doesn't reflect what they thought they were part of. And that's where the tension really begins. Because in today's industry, perception isn't just important, it's everything. And when people feel like their image has been reshaped without their control, the reaction is rarely quiet. Behind closed doors, frustration allegedly turned into open disagreement. And from there, into something bigger, a growing divide between those willing to speak out and those choosing silence, not because they're unaffected, but because they may not be ready for what responding would actually expose. What's making this situation even more explosive is the belief forming around it. This isn't just about a documentary anymore. It's about control, about who gets to tell the story of hip-hop and who becomes part of a narrative they didn't approve. Insiders suggest that conversations are now happening at multiple levels of the industry. Private calls, unfinished negotiations, quiet alignments shifting in real time. Some figures are reportedly considering going public with their own versions of events, while others are holding back, waiting to see what the full release actually contains. But underneath all of that is something more complicated, uncertainty about what else is still hidden. Because according to those familiar with the footage, what's already circulating may only be fragments, and those fragments are already enough to cause damage. That's why some artists aren't responding directly, not because they don't have answers, but because responding might mean opening doors to conversations they've avoided for years. Conversations about old conflicts, past interactions, and moments they assumed were long buried in industry memory. Meanwhile, social media has done what it always does: fill in the gaps. Fans are dissecting every frame, revisiting old interviews, analyzing past relationships, and trying to decode whether what they're seeing now confirms something they suspected all along or rewrites everything entirely. And at the center of it all is 50 Cent, a figure who has never operated quietly in this space. Throughout his career, 50 Cent has built a reputation not just as an artist, but as a strategist in entertainment storytelling. Someone who doesn't just participate in narratives, but constructs them. From music to television to film production, his influence has consistently extended beyond performance into how stories are shaped, framed, and delivered to the public. That influence has always come with friction. Because when you build a brand around unfiltered storytelling and direct confrontation, every new project carries weight. Every release becomes more than content, it becomes a statement. And according to industry discussions, that's exactly why this documentary is hitting so hard. It doesn't feel passive, it feels intentional. And whether that perception is accurate or not, it's now part of the controversy itself. Some insiders claim the footage includes moments involving multiple well-known rappers who did not expect the final framing. They believed their participation would exist within a structured narrative, controlled, contextual, and collaborative. Instead, what appears to be emerging is something looser, more fragmented, and far more interpretive. That gap between expectation and outcome is now the core of the backlash. Because in entertainment, context changes everything. A moment of tension can become a headline. A casual exchange can be reframed as conflict. And once that version spreads, it often moves faster than any clarification ever could. That's why the reactions are so fragmented. Some artists are responding indirectly, choosing coded messages and subtle posts instead of direct confrontation. Hers are reportedly in private discussions, debating whether speaking out helps or worsens the situation. And in the background, a larger debate is forming. What responsibility does documentary storytelling carry when real reputations are involved? Is it simply interpretation and creative framing? Or does it become something heavier when the subjects are real people with ongoing careers, relationships, and histories that can be reshaped in minutes? Commentators are already divided. Some argue this is the nature of modern media, fast, subjective, and always evolving. Others believe that when real lives are part of the narrative, accuracy and fairness stop being optional. Right now, all of those arguments are colliding in one space, and the pressure is building. Because this isn't just about what has already been shown, it's about what hasn't. And that uncertainty is what's driving the conversation forward faster than any official statement could slow it down. At this point, the industry isn't just watching a documentary release. It's watching a test of control, reputation, and narrative power play out in real time. And depending on what comes next, additional footage, public responses, or complete silence, the situation could either stabilize or escalate into something far bigger than anyone involved originally anticipated. Because once a story like this starts unfolding publicly, the real question is what was revealed first. It's what gets revealed next. The situation reportedly reached its boiling point the moment leaked documentary footage broke free from controlled circulation and entered the public space, where nothing can be contained, corrected, or slowed down once momentum takes over. What was originally designed as a curated, tightly controlled narrative quickly transformed into something far more volatile, a public unraveling happening in real time. According to multiple insider accounts, the footage tied to 50 Cent included candid, unfiltered moments featuring several well-known rappers who now believe the final presentation may not reflect the context they originally intended. At first, the reactions were quiet, almost cautious. Private messages allegedly began circulating among industry contacts, not in outrage, but in concern, asking a simple but critical question: how was this edited? Some individuals reportedly felt their words had been taken out of context. Others believed that the sequencing of scenes created emotional impressions that didn't align with what actually happened in real time. In other words, it wasn't necessarily about what was shown, it was about how it was shown. And in an industry built on image, framing is everything. But the situation didn't stay private for long. The moment fragments of the footage reached social media, the entire conversation shifted. Clips were reposted, slowed down, reanalyzed, and stitched together with commentary from users who had no access to the full context. Within hours, interpretations started forming, fast, loud, and irreversible. And once those interpretations took hold, they began spreading faster than clarification ever could. That's when the first major wave of conflict emerged. Sources claim that several rappers began expressing frustration publicly, some through indirect posts, others through carefully worded messages that never named the documentary outright but clearly pointed toward it. Fans didn't need confirmation. They read between the lines, connecting dots that may or may not have been intended to connect. And just like that, speculation became narrative. Then came the turning point that escalated everything further. Insiders allege that some of the individuals featured in the documentary were not fully aware that certain moments would be highlighted in the final structure the way they ultimately were. This alleged disconnect between participation and presentation has now become the central issue driving the backlash. Because it wasn't just about being included. It was about how you were included. In an industry where perception can shape careers overnight, even a slight shift in framing can redefine an artist's public image. A moment that felt casual in real life can appear tense on screen. A conversation meant to be neutral can be interpreted as conflict depending on editing, pacing, and context. And once that version of reality is released, it becomes extremely difficult to undo. As reactions grew louder online, a second layer of tension reportedly began forming behind the scenes. According to unverified reports, internal discussions may already have started between some artists and individuals connected to the production. These conversations are described as cautious, tense, and strategic, focused less on public statements and more on understanding exactly what was released, why it was structured that way, and whether anything can or should be corrected. Questions around consent, narrative control, and editorial responsibility are now allegedly at the center of these private discussions, not just whether people agreed to appear, but whether they agreed to appear this way. Meanwhile, social media continued doing what it does best, accelerating confusion into certainty. Fans began dissecting leaked clips frame by frame. Every pause, every facial expression, every cut was analyzed as if it held hidden meaning. Some argued that the documentary reveals truths the industry normally hides, offering a raw, unfiltered look at relationships, tension, and behind-the-scenes dynamics that rarely reach the public. Others strongly pushed back. They warned that selective editing can completely change meaning, especially when viewers are only seeing fragments without full context. A single clip, they argued, can become misleading not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. And in the absence of clarity, the internet tends to fill gaps with assumption rather than fact. That divide only deepened as influencers, commentary channels, and hip-hop analysts entered the conversation. Each brought their own interpretation, breaking down clips with different angles, theories, and emotional framing. What began as a documentary discussion quickly turned into competing narratives about what the footage really means. At the center of it all stood one unavoidable presence: 50 Cent. As both a central figure in the documentary and a long-standing voice in hip-hop storytelling, his involvement added a second layer of complexity. For supporters, his role reinforces the idea that this project is meant to challenge narratives, expose hidden dynamics, and spark uncomfortable but necessary conversations. For critics, however, it raises concerns about intent. Questions are now being asked about bias, editorial influence, and how much control one individual should have when shaping the portrayal of multiple artists within a single narrative project. Because even if the footage is real, the way it is arranged can completely change what it feels like. And perception, once again, becomes the battleground. Then came the second twist, one that significantly raised the stakes. Anonymous sources began suggesting that the backlash is no longer limited to a small group of individuals. Instead, multiple artists connected to the broader project are reportedly reviewing their involvement altogether. Some are allegedly re-examining how their appearances were used. Others are questioning whether they want their presence associated with the final version at all. If true, this suggests something larger than isolated frustration. It suggests ripple effects. And ripple effects in this industry rarely stay contained. As tension continues to build, key questions remain unanswered. Will more footage be released to provide additional context? Will any of the involved artists issue formal statements to clarify their positions? Or will silence continue to fuel speculation until the situation escalates further? Because right now, nothing feels settled. Instead, the situation appears to be evolving into something deeper than a disagreement over a documentary. It's becoming a broader conflict about narrative ownership. Who controls the story? Who gets to define it? And what happens when those versions of reality don't align? And just when it seemed the situation might stabilize, a new wave of claims pushed it into an even more intense phase. According to multiple unverified but widely circulated insider reports, early reactions were only the surface of a much deeper concern. As more clips continued to spread, additional artists reportedly began re-evaluating their appearances, not just in isolated scenes, but in the broader structure of how the documentary presents relationships, events, and history. What they allegedly discovered triggered a second wave of alarm. Some individuals now believe that certain moments were not only framed differently than expected, but that the overall structure of the documentary may subtly reshape how events are interpreted compared to how they originally occurred in real life. Not necessarily by changing facts, but by rearranging emotional context. And that distinction is critical, because in storytelling, placement is power. The order of scenes, the tone of transitions, and the moments chosen for emphasis can all influence how audiences interpret truth. And once that interpretation spreads, it becomes its own version of reality, one that is difficult to reverse. That realization reportedly shifted the tone behind the scenes. What began as quiet frustration turned into more coordinated concern. Private conversations allegedly started forming between artists, representatives, and individuals tied to the production, all attempting to understand the scope of what had been released and what might still be coming. At the same time, social media activity intensified again. Cryptic posts began appearing from accounts believed to be connected to people in the orbit of THOs featured in the footage. Without naming the documentary directly, these posts reference themes like misrepresentation, selective storytelling, and unfinished truths. Fans immediately linked them back to the ongoing controversy, treating them as indirect confirmations of deeper tension. The online discourse fractured further. One side defended the documentary format itself, arguing that all documentaries involve editing choices and that storytelling always requires selection. From that perspective, the project is simply doing what documentaries do, presenting a version of reality through a specific lens. The other side disagreed strongly. They argued that when real people, reputations, and careers are involved, the responsibility shifts. It's no longer just about storytelling, it's about consequences. A framed moment can impact public perception, business relationships, and legacy in ways that extend far beyond entertainment. And that's where the real conflict lies. Not in whether the footage exists, but in what it means once it leaves the editing room. As fan communities continue dissecting past interviews, appearances, and historical interactions, the situation is becoming less about a single documentary and more about a larger question facing modern media. Who owns the narrative once real life is turned into content? Because once that process begins, control doesn't just sit with the creator. It spreads to viewers, to commentators, to platforms, to anyone willing to interpret it. And right now, all of those interpretations are colliding at once. With tension still building behind the scenes and no clear resolution in sight, one thing has become obvious. This situation is no longer about a few leaked clips. It's about a shifting power dynamic in storytelling itself. And as more reactions surface, one question continues to dominate every conversation in the industry. who gets to define the story when everyone involved believes they lived a different version of it. Threads began circulating that tried to connect the documentary footage involving 50 Cent to earlier moments in hip-hop history, framing it as something bigger than a single project, and instead part of a long-running narrative that's been interpreted, misinterpreted, and reinterpreted for years. And just like that, what started as a documentary controversy began expanding into something far more complex, a debate about history, memory, and who gets to define what really happened in the culture. At the center of it all, 50 Cent remains unavoidable, not just as a participant, but as a driving force whose creative influence is now under a new level of scrutiny. For some observers, his involvement strengthens the project's credibility. They argue that his track record of direct storytelling and industry commentary positions him as someone willing to expose uncomfortable truths rather than protect polished narratives. But others see it differently. They believe that the same outspoken, confrontational approach that built his reputation could also shape how events are framed, intentionally or not, especially when multiple artists and reputations are involved in a single production. And that tension between truth-telling and framing is now sitting at the core of the entire debate. Behind the scenes, the situation appears to be shifting again. Insiders suggest that discussions are no longer limited to frustration or reaction. Instead, there are unconfirmed reports that conversations are happening around clarifications, responses, and potentially even structural adjustments to how certain segments of the documentary are being perceived. Nothing official has been announced, but the fact that these conversations are reportedly taking place at all signals that the impact of the leaked footage is being taken seriously at multiple levels. And then came another turning point. A new wave of alleged reactions began circulating, claims that some individuals connected to the documentary are not only responding publicly or privately, but are also reevaluating how they engage with future collaborations altogether. In other words, the ripple effect may no longer be limited to this single project. It may now be influencing broader decisions across the industry. That shift is what makes this situation feel different. Because what started as a debate about a documentary is now evolving into something much larger, a layered conflict involving creative control, public perception, professional trust, and the long-term consequences of how stories are shaped in entertainment. And despite all the noise, one thing remains unresolved. There is still no unified explanation that fully addresses the concerns raised from every side. That gap is exactly what's fueling the ongoing tension. Every new reaction adds another layer. Every new claim expands the uncertainty. And instead of narrowing the conversation, the situation keeps widening it. At this point, the story is no longer static. It's evolving in real time. And as more voices enter the discussion, the possibility of resolution feels further away, not closer. As the controversy surrounding the leaked documentary footage continued spreading, the public reaction reached a new level of intensity, turning social media into a non-stop cycle of debate, interpretation, and conflict. Within hours, related hashtags began trending across platforms, and the footage was no longer just being watched. It was being dissected, analyzed, and argued over frame by frame. The divide formed instantly. On one side, supporters of 50 Cent defended the project as an attempt to present raw, unfiltered perspectives from within hip-hop. From their point of view, the documentary represents something the culture often avoids: uncomfortable honesty. They argue that this kind of storytelling pulls back the curtain on realities that are usually hidden behind carefully managed public images. On the other side, critics raised serious concerns about fairness and representation. They questioned whether selective editing, intentional or not, could distort meaning. A single cut, a rearranged sequence, or a missing segment can completely change how a moment feels. And when viewers don't have full context, they may form conclusions that don't accurately reflect what actually happened. That disagreement quickly became the engine of the entire debate. As the conversation escalated, commentary creators across YouTube, TikTok, and streaming platforms jumped in, producing detailed breakdowns of the leaked clips. Some slowed footage down, analyzing tone, timing, and body language. Others compared scenes with past interviews and public appearances, searching for contradictions or hidden consistency. Every angle created a new interpretation, and every interpretation created new conflict. Meanwhile, fan communities fractured into competing perspectives. Some viewers fully aligned with the documentary's framing, arguing that it reveals truths the industry rarely acknowledges. Others strongly defended the artists who feel misrepresented, insisting that context is everything and without it, perception becomes distortion. Comment sections became battlegrounds, not discussions, debates, and neither side seemed willing to concede ground. Adding further fuel to the situation were anonymous accounts and unverified posts that began circulating online. These messages referenced unfinished edits, missing context, and intentions misunderstood, suggesting that what the public had seen might not represent the complete picture. Although none of these claims have been verified, they contributed to a growing sense of uncertainty, like there is still another layer of the story waiting to be revealed. Industry commentators also began weighing in, widening the scope of the conversation beyond the specific documentary. Some emphasized that all documentary storytelling contains subjectivity by nature. Editing decisions, narrative structure, and pacing all influence how events are perceived. From this perspective, what's unfolding is not unusual. It's simply the reality of modern media. Others pushed back, arguing that when real people, reputations, and careers are involved, storytelling carries a different level of responsibility. In that view, the issue is not whether editing exists, it's whether editing crosses the line into misrepresentation. And in the digital age, that line is thinner than ever. Because a single clip can now reach millions within hours, detached from its full context, reshaped by commentary, and reinforced by repetition. Once that happens, public perception often solidifies before any clarification can even begin. That's what makes this situation so difficult to contain. Because by the time explanations arrive, the narrative is already built. And at the center of that narrative remains 50 Cent, simultaneously praised and criticized, depending on perspective. To some, he represents a figure willing to challenge controlled narratives and expose uncomfortable truths within the industry. To others, he represents a controversial force whose storytelling approach naturally generates division, especially when multiple reputations are tied to the same project. And right now, both interpretations are competing in real time. With reactions still unfolding, interpretations multiplying, and no final clarity in sight, the situation continues to expand beyond its original scope. What began as a documentary release has now become a broader cultural debate, one that touches on truth, framing, influence, and the power of narrative itself. And as long as new clips, reactions, and theories continue to surface, this story isn't stabilizing. It's escalating. Despite all the opinions, debates, and interpretations, one fact stands out clearly. There is still no single, unified narrative that everyone agrees on. Instead, what exists right now is a fractured landscape of competing perspectives, each supported by selective clips, personal interpretation, and strong emotional investment. And that's exactly why the story refuses to die. Because in situations like this, uncertainty isn't a weakness in the conversation, it's the fuel. As long as there are unanswered questions, conflicting viewpoints, and unresolved concerns, the discussion doesn't fade. It expands. It multiplies. It pulls in new voices every day, each adding another layer to an already complex situation. And that's where things are now. Not settled, not resolved, still shifting. What we're seeing isn't just a reaction to leaked documentary footage involving 50 Cent. It's becoming something bigger. A live debate about storytelling itself, about influence, about perception, and about who gets to decide what the truth actually looks like once it's been edited, packaged, and released into the public. Because in the middle of all this noise, one issue keeps coming back to the surface: the gap between perception and reality. And that gap is exactly what's keeping this controversy alive. Just when it seemed like things might begin to stabilize under public debate, a new wave of alleged insider information emerged, and it completely shifted the tone again. According to unverified reports circulating across anonymous accounts and private forums, there may be additional material connected to the documentary that has not yet been released. That single claim alone was enough to reignite speculation almost instantly. Because if true, it changes everything. Sources suggest that what the public has seen so far might only represent fragments of a much larger archive of recorded material. Some segments, they claim, may have been withheld, restructured, or simply reserved for later release. No official confirmation exists. But in today's environment, confirmation isn't always what drives momentum, possibility is. And the possibility of unseen footage has now forced people to re-examine everything already released. Not just what was shown, but what wasn't. The real tension, however, isn't just about additional footage. It's about what that footage could mean. Insiders claim that unreleased segments may contain extended context to moments already circulating online. Context that could completely shift interpretation, either reinforcing the current narrative, challenging it, or introducing entirely new angles that nobody is prepared for. And that uncertainty has created a pressure point across the entire situation. Because now there are only three possible outcomes. 1. The additional material clarifies misunderstandings and reduces tension. 2. It deepens the divide and intensifies the backlash. Or 3. It completely rewrites what people think they already know. None of those outcomes are neutral. All of them escalate the stakes. At the same time, there are growing suggestions that individuals connected to the broader situation are now reassessing their positions. According to speculative chatter, behind-the-scenes conversations may be happening about whether to stay silent, respond publicly, or strategically time any statements depending on how the narrative continues to evolve. And that kind of hesitation tells its own story. Because silence in moments like this is rarely empty, it's calculated. Meanwhile, online, the conversation continues to accelerate. Fans and commentators are watching closely for any official clarification, follow-up release, or statement that could confirm or deny what's being circulated. But in the absence of that clarity, speculation fills every gap. And speculation doesn't wait for facts, it builds its own version of them. That's why the uncertainty itself has become the engine of the entire situation. Every new post, every rumored detail, every anonymous claim has the potential to shift perception instantly. And once perception shifts, the story shifts with it. At this stage, what began as a documentary release has fully transformed into something much larger. A multi-layered controversy involving narrative control, industry relationships, public perception, and the possibility of unreleased material that could still change everything. And despite all the discussion, the core questions remain unanswered. Is what the public has seen the full picture, or only a fragment of something far larger? Will additional content ever be released to bring clarity, or will silence allow speculation to continue growing unchecked? And if new material does surface, will it support what people currently believe, or completely dismantle it? because that's the reality of where things stand now. Nothing is final, nothing is settled, and nothing about this story feels like it has reached its endpoint. In fact, if the latest claims prove accurate, the most significant moments may still be ahead, and what happens next could reshape not only the current controversy, but how similar stories are told, consumed, and debated in the future. So the question now isn't just about what has already been revealed. It's about what might still be waiting to surface, and whether the next wave of information brings clarity or pushes everything even further into uncertainty.